But do let me know whenever, point at me when I'm supposed to start with the live thing. I know we do have some folks that are going to be coming a little bit later due to lack of food. Yeah, you definitely don't want to be here on an empty stomach. Are you serious? Oh my gosh. And then you find out, actually, we didn't send them to get hamburger from the store. We actually had them go butcher the cow. But it's free range and all that, so it's good. No, I'm just kidding. Was, anyway. I'm good. All right. Well, everyone here in the room, hello. And if you are viewing online, welcome back to week 2. What was that? Oh, yeah. We decided to do a little bit, since you guys can see my face up close and personal, we've got this so that you guys can follow along on the screen with what I'm saying. So you'll just have to look at my face in real life if you're in the room here. The people that are online at home will be able to see me on video. I think you can see me online on video if you're watching online. Hi, I'm Tim. If you don't know me, I'm the teaching minister here at Mount Carmel Christian Church. And we are continuing on in our Build seminar on the parables. And last week we did an introduction on the parables. We looked at the classic case in 2 Samuel 12 of the prophet Nathan using a parable to convict David after his sin. And we use that in order to identify how parables work, what their makeup looks like, and also to battle some misconceptions that we oftentimes have about parables. And I didn't say this last week, but I'm going to say it now. Well, if I didn't, maybe I did say it, I don't know. But if you have had misconceptions about parables, you're not alone. I have too at different points. This is how we learn. So I don't know if anyone out there in the internet land felt like, oh man, I feel dumb because I thought this or that thing. Don't feel dumb. We're all learning. We all have misconceptions, and we all learn differently over time so that we can combat those things. And I just want to say that because I like for people to be encouraged to continue learning the Bible and not to feel any different. And that isn't because anybody said that they felt that way. I just thought of it after the fact, and I figured I'd say it now. So, hello, those joining us. I hope that you, I like to say hi to people. If there weren't, I probably would do it even on Sunday morning, but I don't want to embarrass someone that's not a regular churchgoer person. So, anyway, so we're gonna continue on in our parables. And so the way this class is laid out, if you don't remember, I'm not going to go back through a lot of the introductory stuff from last week, but I will highlight moments as it helps us navigate through. So if you are here tonight or you're watching tonight and you didn't see the first one, I would encourage you to go back and watch so that you can get caught up to speed. But the reason that I'm not going to do much introduction stuff tonight is because the way we laid these seminars out is for the first week to be an introduction, and then the following 3 sessions are what we'll call case studies. Case studies in parables. So this is where we take what we thought about last week and apply it and see if we can better understand parables of Jesus. Now, granted, we are not in a 4-week stretch going to go over every single parable of Jesus. But I'm going to make a little bit of small group plug. If you are in a small group and you're a leader and you got my email, there is available to you a devotional on nearly all of Jesus' parables that you can go through. And if you're not a group leader, but you are in a group and you don't know about this, you have my permission to go to your group leader and say, hey, send me the devotional thing, because it's free use for individuals and groups. So not all groups want to change gears and move from the study they were doing to a new thing, but this devotional can be done on an individual basis and whatnot. So if you are experiencing our message series, if you are taking part in these build seminars and you want more parables, do them with the small group material that we just released on Monday. So, the parable that we're going to look at tonight is one that actually shows up in 3 different places throughout what we call the Synoptic Gospels. You might not have heard the term Synoptic Gospels before. Let me explain it. The word synoptic means something akin to same, and we label the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptic Gospels because the 3 of them share an abundance of material and, for the most part, follow the same narrative layout as the others. So now there's a difference between synoptic Gospels, which are those 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then the term canonical Gospels. Canonical meaning the term from the term canon, which is the official canon of the New Testament, the books that make up the New Testament. And within the canon or the canonical Gospels, we're talking about all 4 Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The reason John isn't considered a synoptic is because it does not follow the same pattern and narrative structure as the other 3. And I'm not going to bore you with all of the ins and outs of why there are similarities between those 3 and where they diverge. But it's important to know that because we're going to look at a parable that shows up in 3 different places. And it's important to recognize that there are many reasons why we might have 4 different Gospels and 3 that follow a similar pattern and with similar stories, but still has variations. And that's because someone decided to write a gospel for a particular Christian community, and while they were doing the research with eyewitnesses and laying out the stories about Jesus, they did so in a manner where the stories that were laid out would speak to the community that they're writing from within or writing for. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, probably have different regions that they live in, different Christian communities they're involved in, different Christian communities that they have influence over in some way. And so they're writing and styling their gospel to speak to those communities that they're familiar with. It's somewhat similar to the role of preaching that we do here at church. I was just talking to somebody the other day. We are familiar with our congregation. We know our people. I know you all in the room. I probably know you online, maybe, and I know other people, and I think about you when I'm thinking about how to talk about a scriptural passage and what I'm going to say about it, because I want it to reach you where you're at. So I wouldn't just walk into a church across the country and say all the exact same things I would say here. I would want to get to know those people and speak, even if I said the same message from the same passage. And so you have that going on. And the reason that's important is because when we see a parable, like the parable of the sower that we're going to look at here, and we see that it's in 3 different Gospels, the content may be near identical, although there are minute differences. They are meant to function differently in each gospel for the overall narrative that's being told about Jesus than they might in, Matthew is going to function differently than it does in Mark, than it does in Luke, even though we're hearing the same story. And even then, by the way, it's entirely possible, plausible, probable even, that Jesus didn't just say this parable one time. Jesus is an itinerant preacher. which means unlike Dee Dee and Aaron Adams and me here at Mount Carmel, where we preach to our congregation here at Mount Carmel, an itinerant preacher is someone that goes place to place, preaching all over. In the United States, there were during revival days, there were itinerant preachers that would go town to town and preach, and it was actually a big spectacle during past generations here or whatever. So. People still go on tour and talk, although I don't really know, given the amount of churches that exist, that we think very much about an itinerant preacher going from place to place. But for someone like Jesus, he would go place to place and preach and teach and heal and do all those things. And the reason that's also important is, so when we think of 3 different Gospels, we have 3 different authors writing to different communities and styling or thinking about the stories they're going to tell as it would apply to their audience. But Jesus, when doing his teaching, thought about his direct audience. So if he taught the parable of the sower on multiple occasions, he would probably nuance it a little bit differently for each audience that he was teaching. And if he had an audience that just knew nothing about farming at all, it wasn't in their repertoire of things that they do in life and ways that they make a living, he probably wouldn't have used this parable to that particular group. He would have used one that spoke into their situation. And so we don't often think about those background things, and you don't really have to dig very far to think about them. You just have to pause and say, oh, that's right. So we've got 3 different Gospels, and we've got these stories, and I see that they're the same, but there might be little differences. I wonder why. Well, there's 2 reasons why there might be differences there in terms of, the details. And the reason it's important to pay attention to differences in details is because the details mattered. They mattered to Jesus when he taught people. And they mattered to Matthew, Mark, and Luke when they used these stories, because every little detail in these short stories by Jesus that we call parables conveyed meaning that was meant to be drawn out and understood. Are you following with me so far? So there's my intro to this particular parable that we're going to look at. And if you look through your packet there, you're going to notice that we have in this the text from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all lined up here. And I'm not going to read each one out loud here, but I am going to summarize the parable because the parable, in terms of these texts, flows very similarly. In some instances, we get the opportunity where Jesus teaches his disciples when they ask him what the parable means. In other cases, we don't always get to see that unfold. And even if it does unfold in the same manner in all 3 Gospels, like in this parable, there are just always little nuanced differences here. But we're going to talk about those as we go through the bullet points of considering what we learned about parables and how to understand them. So I will encourage you to at some point go back and read through these, and also to read some context around the parables after we talk about it and see what stands out to you. So there's your homework. Instead of waiting to the end of class, I'm giving you your homework now. And you online, do your homework too. I'll find out if you... I'm just kidding. I won't find out at all. Well, actually, I could, I guess, if you email or anyway, whatever. Okay. So the parable of the sower, and this is really funny. This was never, it was planned, but it was, I didn't make the plan. So I guess God made the plan. And then, Dee Dee made the plan with the preaching schedule. I happen to preach on this parable as it is in the Gospel of Luke. when we opened up the message series that we're doing called Aha, Jesus Stories for Change, which is about the parables from the Gospel of Luke. And so the parable of the sower is an interesting one. It's interesting because Jesus uses the situation of a farmer, or in this case, to be more precise, a sower of seed, someone that has seeds in their possession. They have a plot of land. It's likely the majority of the land is probably ready soil to take on the seed. And this person is going to go out and scatter the seed around. And so this person does that in the story that Jesus tells. And in scattering the seed, as the sower does, the seed falls along different paths. For instance, some seed falls along the path where birds come in to eat. Some fall on rocky places where they didn't have very much soil, and so the plants sprang up too quickly, but because the soil is shallow, it just got scorched by the sun. It just didn't have much of a chance. Then the third one is we get this idea of seed falling among thorns, thistles. This means that the plant is going to grow up and it's going to end up having a battle for survival with the thorny, less helpful and productive plants around it, and it will end up being choked out and snuffed out. And then the fourth one that Jesus mentions in this parable is the good soil, the ready soil. And the seed that falls along the good soil ends up growing up and producing crop. And if you're glancing at these parables in your packet, or if you're looking at them in your Bible, you'll notice that this is one of the places where there are some differences in the way that the story is said. For instance, in Luke, the parable we looked at in our sermon series, Jesus just says that the crop produces 100 times more than what was sown. But in Mark, for instance, and I believe Matthew follows Mark in this. You can check my work here in the packet. Jesus actually gives a bit of a numerical value. Some produce 30-fold, some produce 60-fold, and some 100-fold. And so people have taken those numbers and supplied meaning to them. There might be, or it just might be that Matthew and Mark remembered Jesus mentioning it this way, and maybe when Luke's heard his version from whatever eyewitness it was he heard, they just heard Jesus say it this way. Or it could be, some people turn this into like a competition, like, oh, I really hope that I'm the seed that falls on good soil and I produce 100-fold, and not like you 30-fold people over there. You need to get some, better work done in your life. No, I'm just kidding. So people will take that and turn it into this scaled up situation. I'm not so sure that that's what Jesus had in mind in saying that, but we can talk about that a little bit. And as I said before, Jesus, actually before I go to what I said before, another thing that you'll notice here is in Matthew, Jesus' explanation about why he speaks in parables is a little bit more long-winded in Matthew than it is in Mark and Luke. So there's another difference there. And so you'll notice that in Matthew, the disciples came to him and wanted to better understand the parable. Mark reiterates this, but he says it a little bit different. It says, when he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him. So this is an interesting detail. This is where we might gloss over this. So we look at Matthew and we say, well, the disciples came to him, the disciples. But then in Mark, we see the 12 and others came. It's possible and even probable that Matthew and Mark are saying the same thing here. But if you're a modern reader and you hear the word disciples, you may automatically zero in on the 12. But see, Jesus had more than just 12 disciples. He named 12 as his kind of inner circle, his apostles, his ones that he would send out on mission. Although even then, there were times where he sent more than 12 out, if you read through like the Gospel of Luke, for instance. But the idea here is that when Matthew uses the word disciples, he's probably speaking of more than just the 12. But Mark, for whatever reason, wants to emphasize that the 12 were part of the group that are asking Jesus about the explanation of the parable, but he adds that there are others. Now, he doesn't say that other disciples around him, but that's kind of implied since the 12 are there. And these people are close enough to Jesus that they have the opportunity to ask him in private what the parable means. And then, of course, Luke follows Matthew in saying that the disciples asked him rather than the 12 and others. So you get these little details of difference, and then, like I said, Matthew shows Jesus giving a longer explanation, and then, of course, Jesus explains the parable. And I'm not going to get into every little detail of every little word that's different in here. And what's really interesting is, if you're like me and you're a Greek geek and you compare, you really start seeing the differences if you were laying the Greek text side by side here. Although sometimes English translations, since different translators work on different Gospels, sometimes show you differences that actually are less different in the Greek text. So that one can blow your mind for a little while. That's just the nature of translating from one language to another. But Jesus, in effect, while he gives his explanation for why he speaks in parables and why he gives that weird bit about seeing they won't perceive and hearing they won't understand, which we can get into in a moment. He does explain in private to his disciples the meaning of the parable, which is incredibly helpful for us. And it's the reason why my guy Bobby Miller and I, when we were laying this out after we were working on this, put this one as the first case study, because when you're reading the Gospels and you come across parables that Jesus teaches and he doesn't give explanation in the Gospel, we find ourselves in the same position as his disciples or his audience, hoping we get it right along with them. In the case of this parable, since Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include this encounter where Jesus' disciples ask him in private what the parable means, we also get Jesus explaining the parable. And this is helpful because, although I'm going to add a caveat that we need to be careful about, here's the helpful thing. The helpful thing is that we can see Jesus' logic in this particular parable. Now, we don't want to take that and start applying it everywhere, because Jesus is, well, he's Jesus. He's really smart. So he could be doing a whole slew of different things as we establish about parables. So we don't want to always try to find the one-for-one connection that Jesus shows his disciples when he's explaining the story. But it is nice to be able to look at what Jesus says to his disciples in terms of explaining this parable and saying, well, that can at least give me a little bit of a measure when I'm looking at the other parable he's teaching. I can at least understand why it is Jesus uses parables, and I can understand at least his logic in one, and maybe that'll help me understand why he might have said this parable here and this parable there, and so on and so forth. So taking what we know about parables and how they're designed, and if you remember last week, we said they're short stories, and that they normally are short stories based off of what would be considered plausible or realistic scenarios that the people that are hearing the story would have been accustomed to understanding. And yet, while they're rooted in realism, they also tend to have a bit of outrageousness in order to draw the person listening to the story in and help them toward understanding or kind of creating that, and hence the reason we named the sermon series we did, a bit of an aha moment. So when we're looking at this particular parable, in any of the parables about Jesus, and this is where I tie together all that background that we've just gone through, plus looking over the details of the parable, we end up with a few different questions that we want to consider reading this parable and trying to understand it. And I'm going to go through the questions, and then we're going to go through the bullets under them. The first one is, what were the surrounding circumstances that led to the use of this parable? What were the surrounding circumstances? And by that, we are specifically meaning, what are the circumstances around what was happening before and maybe sometimes after the parable in the story about Jesus? Does that make sense? So, what was Jesus doing and saying? Where was he at? What community was he in? To whom was he speaking this parable in the story? And the reason I say that is because when you look at the Gospels, and maybe not in this instance necessarily, but oftentimes you'll see a parable that has a different context backdrop. So, Jesus might have been on a boat and got off the boat and then told a parable, for instance, and then that same parable gets used by another gospel writer, except that time he was walking from another town and then tells this parable once he got to the next town he's going to. And that does matter, that the gospel writer remembers that parable or placed that parable that he got from an eyewitness in that spot in the story because of the story he's trying to tell. So that's the first question. The second one is, how might Jesus' audience have responded to the parable? And again, I want to specify here, the first question is about Jesus' immediate context that he tells the parable in. This, we're talking about the audience Jesus is speaking to in that context, not necessarily the gospel audiences. Now, you might be saying, what? What do you mean by that? Okay. When I say a gospel audience, I mean when Matthew wrote his gospel later, after Jesus had died, been buried, resurrected, and ascended to heaven, however long it was before Matthew wrote, at some point in time, Matthew wrote a gospel within and to a Christian community. That Christian community is not the same audience as the one Jesus is speaking to when he told the parable. Does that make sense? People are different. It's like if I were to tell you all a story right now, and then 10 years later, it was just such a memorable story. I'm sure. I'm just kidding. 10 years later, you go and you tell that story to a group of friends over coffee. The audience is different, right? Now, one caveat here is that you were in the original audience that heard the story from me, but the people you're telling the story to, they weren't. And you're probably going to tell the story pretty accurately, but you're going to probably say it in a way that the people you're speaking to will best understand it and best need to hear it for whatever reason you've chosen to tell the story. And so we do need to differentiate between Jesus' immediate audience that he's speaking to and the audience that's going to receive the gospel text later, which also then there's a third audience, and that's us, because we're different from both of those audiences, but we have our gospels today, and so we have to think about what it means to us, but that's the last step in the process, and we'll get to that question in a second. The third question is, how might the Gospels recipients have responded to the parable? Okay, do you see what I've done there? So we move from Jesus' initial audience. Now we're thinking about how might the community that received Matthew, Mark, and Luke have understood this gospel in light of their circumstances and in light of the way the gospel is laid out, that they were, because here's the thing, the earliest Christians that received these writings, they didn't have them all together in one Bible. One community had their Matthew gospel, and one had their Mark, and one had their Luke. And some people might have known that all of those three were circulating, or maybe two of them were circulating, but they didn't have copies of them. They had whichever one that they had, And they had that for a reason, because they were the group of people that they were probably written to and for at that time. And I will tell you that this question is a little bit harder to answer, because the reality of biblical scholarship is that this question about the Gospels recipients or the Gospels audience is normally formed by what I'll call educated speculation. So we know the circumstances that were going on as time went forward. We can look at history, we can look at archaeology, we can consider the potential regions, and then we can read the text and say, that sounds like something that would have applied to a Galilean at that time. I bet this was a Galilean audience, but we're not really all that sure. And by the way, the theory I just gave you about the different audiences, there are people that will dispute that one too. There's actually a really good book, if you like really big, thick books to read, by Richard Bauckham, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I love that book. I don't always agree with him, but you'll learn something if you read it. But he does not go as far as I would about the audience thing. He takes a different approach or whatever. So there's differences of opinion on that, but they're all rooted in educated guesses rather than just pure speculation. But it is something you want to think about. The fourth of our 6 questions is, how might Jesus' audience have been convicted by the parable? So we're jumping back to Jesus' initial audience. How might they have heard and been convicted by it if they understood it? The 5th question is, how might the Gospels recipients have been convicted by the parable? So the community that received Matthew, how would they have heard it? And finally, us as the audience today, because that's why we study the Bible, right? We want to learn it, so what? We can live it out, right? So we got to think about, okay, now that I understand how this might have been understood by Jesus' audience and the original gospel audience, I've got a better, more firm grasp on what the parable probably means, and now I need to apply it to my life and try to live in light of what I've learned there. So we don't ever want to leave ourselves out of the equation, because while Scripture, this is a quote I picked up from somebody a long time ago, but it stuck with me. Scripture was not written to us, but it was written for us. Does that make sense? So that's why we want to do all this work. So going back to this first question, what were the surrounding circumstances that led to the use of this parable? If you are looking in your document here, you'll see that there are a few lines on these 3 bullets. Please know, this is not the end, the final word on this subject matter. This is some summary thoughts here. I always encourage further reading to understand the surrounding circumstances, the context. If you have a good study Bible, I've got one up here. I'm sure many of you have study Bibles. If you don't, you can find one. If you ever want to know about other Bible resources, just ask me and I can point you in the direction. Although I do like to tell people I don't know every book in the world. This is really funny. I really appreciate that people would think that, but people will be like, hey, you heard of this book? I want to know what you think about it. Or I'd never even heard of the author before. But I will point you to things that I'm familiar with and that I think would be good resources if you ever want to. But what we've laid out here is just Mark, Matthew, and Luke, since those are our Gospels. And these are just some surrounding circumstances that are, again, plausible given what we know about history and whatnot for why this parable would be used. And specifically in these cases, this is considering the background or the surrounding circumstances that the parable's told in the story. So for instance, here you see that in Mark, we wrote down that in Mark, Jesus tells this parable after the religious authorities and his own family question him. So he also does the lampstand parable after this parable in Mark. And then Mark's gospel also follows a geographical sequence from Galilee to Jerusalem, ending at the cross and the empty tomb. So the reason that the geography is important here is that most of Jesus' ministry happens in and around Galilee in the Gospel of Mark. That's like, if you're looking at a map while you're reading Mark, and you look at like a first century map of where the locations are, it's all about heading to Jerusalem. So he's hitting all of the places, all of the farm villages and places like that on the way to Jerusalem in the story. That's how Mark sets up. And so the reason that's important is, as we said at the outset, and you can figure out by reading, Jesus is telling a story about a farmer. And there would have been a lot of farmers in his audience in the places that he's traveling in. So that sets up that way. And then it's interesting that this parable occurs right after Jesus is not only questioned by the authorities, but his own family questions him. And you guys might be familiar that, you know, Jesus' mother and brothers, and so they're kind of like, Jesus, you seem to have lost your mind. And so, you know, Jesus tells this parable after that, and the reason that it's important to consider that background in this particular case is that the parable of the soils, the seed, the sower, is such where Jesus makes the claim that effectively not everyone gets it. And isn't it interesting? The religious authorities to the Jewish people would have been the ones that everyone assumed would have got it. And even if you're a big fan of Jesus and you're reading this gospel and you're reading the story, you'd have thought his family would have got it. And Jesus is making the point that it's not about whether you're my relative or whether you're an upper elite. What matters is whether you have received the word and produce fruit from it. So that's the circumstances around which Mark places this gospel. Now, if you look here, Matthew, it says likewise in his gospel, the parable is told after the same conflict as in Mark. So he's got the conflict with the authorities and the conflict with his family. However, as you'll see in the notes here, unlike Mark, the parable is followed by a parable about wheat and weeds. Matthew's gospel interprets Jesus through the character type of Moses, but presents Jesus as greater than Moses. So you get the wheat and the weeds parable, which is kind of similar in one sense to this parable. Now, the reason that this is important that we added in how Matthew presents Jesus. So are you familiar with the Sermon on the Mount? So Jesus, if you remember, is in the wilderness. How long? Anyone remember how long he's in the wilderness? 40 days. Tempted, kind of hungry, needed a Snickers. And he comes out of the wilderness and he goes to the mountainside and he delivers his famous Sermon on the Mount. Now, does that sound familiar to you Old Testament folk in here by any chance? Can you think of a people group in the number 40 in the wilderness? Huh? The Israelites? Anybody? Yeah. And Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. Anyway, any ringing a bell? See, Jesus is being presented in Matthew's gospel similarly to the way the book of Exodus and so on presents Moses, except that Matthew makes the claim that where Moses failed, Jesus does not. And by the way, those of you that, and sorry if you're online and you haven't been, but there's another group that I've had the privilege of talking, and some of the folks in the room are a part of that. And we've been going through the books of Samuel. And if you remember way back at the beginning, 1 Samuel, I pointed out that Luke does a similar thing that Matthew does, except that he looks at Jesus through the lens of the figure of Samuel. In fact, there are similarities to Mary doing a little song in the beginning of Luke, to Hannah in 1 Samuel doing that. So we see these Gospels number one, the Gospel writers, very familiar with their Old Testament, by the way, but they're using these types and these plot lines to place the stories from the eyewitnesses of Jesus on those plot lines to make a point about Jesus. And so if you're Matthew and you're making this point about Jesus and bringing in comparison to Moses, but Jesus is greater than Moses, then you're going to use these stories to really hammer home the point that, again, it's about being open to the Word of God through Jesus and the things of the kingdom, and to letting that grow and bear fruit rather than simply assuming that by virtue of being part of a people that you're on the good side with God. Does that make sense? And then finally, here we have that Luke deviates from Mark's structure and places the parable after Jesus forgives a sinful woman and acquires additional female followers. Luke's account interprets Jesus through the character type of Samuel, which I just mentioned, but presents Jesus greater than Samuel. He depicts Jesus as the king that delivered where the kings of Israel failed. So Jesus is presented as king. And by the way, it's really interesting because Jesus says things in the Gospel of Luke, for instance, like, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over you, because his disciples wanted to get power positions next to Jesus. And they're like, no. That's how the Gentile world does it, but in my kingdom, the first will be last, the servant will be most important, that sort of thing. So all the kings of Israel ultimately failed to not only honor God, but they did what Samuel warned the people about. If you go back to 1 Samuel, if you're not familiar with it, the people at the time wanted a king like the other nations, and Samuel warns them and says, this isn't going to go well for you, and yet God says to go ahead and relent and give them what they want, effectively saying they're going to learn their lesson. So where the kings failed the Israelites and failed God and did exactly what Samuel said they would, Jesus as king does not fail. Jesus is not a king like the Gentiles around. He will do things differently, and his kingdom will be different than the kingdoms of the world. Now, it's interesting, though, to consider that Mark and Matthew place the parable after conflict with Jesus' own family and with the religious leaders, and yet Luke places it after what I guess we would consider a positive story where Jesus forgives a sinful woman. But again, it wouldn't be that shocking, because if you take into account that context and consider the parable, while the parable can be scary to take in on one hand, considering, if you sit and think about, oh man, the seed, they fall in these places and they don't produce fruit. That's not good. I don't want to be in that situation. But in the case of Luke, it opens you up to the happy ending of the story, which is that not only does the seed fall on good soil, it produces more than the other seed would have produced had it all done its thing. And so you and if you even look at Luke, at the way that Jesus explains the parable at the end, if we go back here for a moment, he says this idea about, says the seed on good soil stands for those with a noble and good heart who hear the word, retain it, and by persevering produce a crop. Now I want to just show you a difference here. When you look at Mark, it says, Jesus says, others like seed sown on good soil hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop. Now that sounds the same, right? Except if you think about it, the words that Jesus is using in Luke really hit to the heart of the matter. They have more punch to them, right? They hear the word, they retain it, they persevere. Both of them look like different, or the same outcome, but Luke's emphasis Luke is really emphasizing the good that comes out of the ending of the story, which is interesting when you then think, oh, that's funny because he tells this parable after the sinful woman is forgiven, rather than telling the parable after Jesus is in a bit of tension with people that should have gotten it and didn't. Does that make sense with you? So that's why it's important to understand the circumstances around, because you've got the same parable. It's got largely the same details, but just the context that you're reading the parable around, if it doesn't change the meaning of the parable, it at least changes the way the parable's meant to function for the person reading each individual gospel. And so that's why I want to look at that one. So the second question that we have is, how might Jesus' audience have responded to the parable? And we note two things here, and I'll summarize them because a lot of this came up in a sermon I did recently, and if you didn't hear it, I'll still not leave you in the dark here. But first and foremost, the people could have been confused by a farmer recklessly throwing seed around. One, because any kind of any livestock, any kind of seed, it was precious. There was an urgency. There was a time to do this, and you didn't want to lose out on what limited resource you had to earn a living and to produce food. And then, secondly, that might not be exactly how farming might have been done. Because people would have carefully prepared the ground for the seed and carefully placed it in the prepared spots. Now, I want to make a note here that the only reason that we point that second one out is because Jesus doesn't stop to tell us that the sower tilled their land to make it ready for the seed. Now, it is the case that where the realism comes in for Jesus is that a sower would have just scattered the seed out like this. So I don't want you to hear what we've just put in these notes and say, oh, so I guess the sower really would have meticulously made sure the seed was everywhere. No, what Jesus is telling really would have happened. Not every seed would have fallen on the right path, but there would have been legwork done leading up to the scattering of the seed that Jesus doesn't include in this parable. And so if you were someone listening to Jesus, and you're hearing the story, you might have thought, well, would someone have been that reckless, Jesus? They might have thought that. So we wanted to include that in here. But then we note in the second bullet point here that the meaning of the parable would have been much more disturbing to Jesus' audience. And that's because, and I noted this with the geography in Mark, Jesus' initial audience would have largely been made up of Galilean farmers, tradesmen, people that were living off the land, people that were accustomed to this. They would have immediately captured the realism of Jesus' parable. And when he tells this parable in the manner that he does, it would have dawned on them that, this thing that happens in farming actually tells a story that's not so comforting. Because if you're a Jewish person at the time of Jesus, which Jesus and all of his earliest followers were Jewish, you thought by virtue of being one of God's chosen people that you were good to go. And Jesus tells this parable that says, that's not the way it works. And all he needs to do to bring that shocking and scary to consider idea to the forefront is tell a little gardening parable. And so his initial audience probably would have been shocked and dismayed by his parable because they essentially assumed that they were God's chosen people based on ethnicity, religion, and heritage. And yet every occurrence of this parable is followed by Jesus' own disciples questioning him about it. And this is key here. And I kind of said this to make us feel better about not understanding parables, but it should not be lost on us. I said this a second ago, and I'll say it again. Jesus and all of his earliest followers were Jewish, including the 12 that go on and form the early leadership of the church, minus Judas Iscariot. But they go on and they form the early church, and they become the established leaders. They were concerned about the parable. Now, they probably also didn't understand. They tell Jesus they want him to explain it. But it's also possible that they weren't asking Jesus in private what the parable meant because they didn't understand it. It could be because they couldn't stomach it. The likelihood is that there was a mix of both. There were probably people in Jesus' inner circle that did not understand what this little simple parable about farming meant. And there were probably some in his inner circle that did catch on to it and said, are you, I don't know if Peter, I like to think Peter was probably a not understand person, but anyway, I'm just kidding. But let's say he was and he just didn't like it. He's nudging John over here. Is he saying what I think he's saying? Did we follow the right guy? I don't like what I'm hearing here. So anyway, so Jesus' initial audience, being well aware of the type of story and the realism that Jesus is telling, also would have been shocked by what Jesus was saying, given the fact that they were Galilean Jewish people that were his initial audience. So we not only derive understanding about the parable based on where it's placed in each gospel, when we look at the audience surrounding Jesus that's hearing this parable, we can understand how they might have understood the parable or how it might have affected them. Next, we think about the Gospels Recipients, and again, as I said, this is the most speculative of the ways that we, or the things that we want to consider here. But the big one here is that within Mark, he uses this parable to challenge the idea that belonging to the Jerusalem religious establishment makes a person inherently right with God. So instead, the parable highlights that the faithful followers of Jesus who bear fruit are the ones who are truly members of God's kingdom and family. This parable is placed early in the gospel and was a subtle critique of the teaching. Hang on a second. Was a subtler critique than the teachings he delivered once he was in Jerusalem itself. The reason I point that out is the Gospel of Mark, the climax of the story is in Jerusalem. And there's this scene where Jesus effectively predicts the end of the temple being destroyed, which was kind of like the hub, the epicenter of Judaism at the time. This is a pretty big deal. To add a little bit of context here, Mark, by majority of Bible scholar nerds, is believed to be the first gospel written. And most believe that it was probably written around the time either before or right after 70 AD, which, if you know your history, is when the temple was destroyed and sacked by the Romans. And so, it should not be shocking if this gospel could have been written to a Galilean audience at the time of the destruction of the temple. And why would we think that? Well, because Jesus spends a lot of time around Galilee in the story. It's like the greatest hits of Galilee Jesus ministry are caught up in Mark. And then it ends with not good stuff happening around Jerusalem, right? Because, Jesus is arrested and all that stuff unfolds. And by the way, and this is fun, if you look in your Bibles at the end of the Gospel of Mark, you'll notice that there are two little breaks in chapter 16 where we're told that there's an additional ending and then a longer additional ending to Mark. And your notes in the bottom of your Bible will probably tell you that those additional stories weren't in the earliest manuscript evidence. Most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark ends with an empty tomb and the ladies at the empty tomb running away frightened. And there's a good reason that Mark probably ended his story that way, because he's assuming his audience of Jesus believers already knows what the ending of the story is and wants them to ask a question. What will I do with the story of Jesus? And so, will I revert back to this system that is in trouble because the temple, the epicenter of worship, is either soon to be destroyed or has already been destroyed, and I'm thinking about this? Or am I going to actually follow in the steps of Jesus and live out my faith and share faith with the world around me and whatnot? And I'm asking this as a Galilean person that thought Jerusalem was probably pretty special, but I didn't live around there. I lived on the outskirts in the farming village. And so those are some thoughts about the Mark audience and what they might have been thinking, or how they might have responded to this parable that Jesus tells that, again, would have been shocking to his initial audience. Matthew, similarly to Mark, is critiquing the Jerusalem establishment as well, hence the reason that that Matthew presents Jesus as a Moses, on the Moses template here. However, Matthew emphasizes the critique further by filling stories with more details, or as in this case, stacking similar parables. So if you remember, when we looked at the direct context, we said that the parable of the wheat and weeds, which has a very similar meaning to it as this parable, comes right after this parable in sequence in Matthew. And so, and we also noted that when we look at Matthew, we get more explanation from Jesus about why he speaks in parables. It's a little bit longer. And so Matthew and Mark have a very similar agenda with their gospel. And I'm using the word, please don't take the word agenda and think it's the worst word in the world. For whatever reason, it's like if you have an agenda, it's like bad nowadays for whatever reason. Everybody has an agenda in life. Some agendas are really good and some of them aren't. In the case of the gospel writers, I think we can all agree the agenda is really good. But the point being is that Matthew and Mark have a similar agenda, but their audience might be a little bit different. Matthew's audience is a little bit more difficult to figure out than Mark's. And the reason is the geography thing. Mark is very overt about the places Jesus is at, and you're almost thinking, this gospel is probably written for the people that we're telling these stories about in some capacity, or at least in the same geography, the same area, similar upbringing, all those sorts of things. Matthew, because it's structured the way it is, it's harder to understand what Jewish group Matthew might have been writing to. The other thing, and this is aside from the parable, but you should know this, Mark and Matthew are the most hypercritical of the disciples, and specifically Peter. Peter and the disciples don't look very good in Matthew and Mark at all. And Luke and John, they look really good, actually, believe it or not. Luke and Acts are one set of books, 2 volumes in one. And we get Peter's redemption from Jesus, and then John, we get the whole scene where Jesus restores Peter around fire with fish for breakfast in the morning, which is a weird food to eat for breakfast, but I'm not from over there. Anyway, so we get that. So it's also interesting that these parables occur after disagreements with religious elites. This might shock you for me to say this, because also, guess who the religious elites are in terms of Christianity by the time the Gospels are written down? Nope, the 12. Yep, the 12, they're the apostles. They're the ones that get sent out. They start the establishment of the Jewish church. And look, here's the deal. I know we read Acts chapter 2 and 4, and we think that the church is all hunky-dory because everyone laid everything at the apostles' feet and everyone's needs were met and all that stuff. It was a lovely picture for 2 chapters. But just like I always like to say, there were 2 really good chapters in Genesis and then everything fell apart. Well, it doesn't take much church history to know everything hasn't gone swimmingly well in church history, which means we all as Christians, even Christian leaders, critique each other and attack each other and challenge each other and disagree and get in fights and all that stuff. Well, it shouldn't shock you to find out that after just 1 or 2 generations of the early church, people started getting at it with the original 12. In fact, one of our favorite guys in the New Testament, his name's Paul. He wrote a lot of letters. He gets into a big fight with Peter. So it shouldn't shock us that the Gospels might be. Now, I'm not saying they're saying that the disciples didn't make it in the grand scheme. I'm not saying they're outside looking in. I'm saying that the Gospels may be critiquing the religious authority, and in a way of saying, hey, religious authority can be really good unless it goes sideways. And just because you were Jesus' appointed people doesn't mean you don't still have to follow Jesus the way you're supposed to. And so it's interesting that Matthew and Mark portray the disciples in a not great light. Whereas in Luke and John, Peter, who's always the representative of the 12, by the way, in the Gospels, is fully redeemed in those Gospels. So they have a much better view. Anyway, so it's interesting that happens. And then Luke is more focused on challenging the audience to be a people who perceive and understand Jesus' teachings. Remember, I said it focuses more heavily on the positive outcome of the story, and it falls after this sinful woman being forgiven, rather than focusing on challenging the audience to question their standing before God or to question anybody's standing before God. And that's really important to understand because the parable really does two things. It dismantles our notion that by being people of God by heritage, religion, or whatever, ethnicity, that we're automatically in. And yet at the same time, it gives hope to those that choose to follow and persevere in the faith because they know they're on the right track. They'll produce fruit. And so this parable, and remember, we said last week, parables aren't just nice little kid stories that have one little moral. They sometimes are trying to say multiple things at once. And this parable is a perfect example. It's teaching us two ideas using one simple story that Jesus does. And then when the gospel writers end up using it for their audience, it can make even more deep points based off where their audience is at in terms of their faith walk. Does all this make sense so far? All right. These last three, these next two are quicker to go through, but I want us to land on this last one. I want to have time for questions here. So, how might Jesus' audience have been convicted by the parable? Jesus' audience obviously would have been convicted by the parable because they would have been left to reckon with the fact that by virtue of simply being Jewish, God's chosen people, that they were on the right path. Instead, they needed to be good soil and receive the word, understand it, apply it, and persevere in doing those things, which makes their special standing not so special, and yet it levels the playing field because anybody from any part of the world, from any walk of life, that does hear the word and take it in and understand and apply it and live it out for the rest of their life has an opportunity to be on right path with God just as much as the quote-unquote chosen people in the story. So that's how Jesus' initial audience, and there's really not much wiggle room there because we know Jesus' initial audience that heard this parable was all Jewish Galilean people. You can pick that up from the story. Now, how might the gospel recipients have been convicted by the parable? Again, there's speculation there, but the audience could have been convicted in at least two ways. Number one, they might have been prompted to challenge their own assumptions about their right standing with God and who is in right standing with God. This would apply especially to the Jew versus Gentile debate that happened within the early church. Jewish followers of Jesus started seeing Gentiles converted, and they're like, well, wait a minute, don't they have to follow my Judaism? And then that became a big issue. But I want you to hold on to number one, because when we get to this last question about how we take on this today, that's where I want us to be shocked. So hold on to that one. The second one here is they might have been challenged to listen better so that they gain a better understanding of Jesus' teachings beyond the seemingly simple stories he told. Now, remember, I said every detail matters. And you might, this whole time, or as we've been thinking about parables as a church, thought to yourself, why maybe first does Jesus not always explain his parables in the Gospels? But there's an opposite version of that question. Why did we get this explanation of this parable at all? And there might be something that the gospel recipients needed to understand. And that is that even Jesus' inner circle, those special to Jesus, they didn't understand it exactly. And so, the fact that they asked Jesus in private and he gives them the explanation would clue people that were hearing or reading this gospel over time to hopefully be willing to do the same. which gets back to what I said last week, that it's okay to not understand, but that we should strive to do the work and to submit to the guidance of the Spirit and to pray and study so that we can understand. And so this story and Jesus' explanation of it provides a motivation for listeners to do that. So finally, that gets us to our last question. What lessons can we draw from this parable, and how can we apply them? And the first one here, and this is where I go back to number one and the last one, remain humble before God. And what do we mean? Well, do not assume that God is in your corner by mere virtue of being a what? Church-going Christian. See, the thing is as much as we like to look at this story and say, oh, see, the chosen people of God, the Jewish people, they all missed it. Jesus was there. They thought that just by virtue of being Jewish, they were good to go. Shame on them. I got Jesus and they didn't accept him. Except what do we do today? We come to church. We got our church membership card. We take our church bulletin. We've got them stacked up in the back seat of our car so that our friends and neighbors can look in and see we're church people. And we assume the same thing about ourselves that the people Jesus originally told this parable to assumed about themselves. That because of our position and because, any of us that might have been raised in church, practically the same thing as a Jew. A Jewish person couldn't help that they were born Jewish. And if you were raised in a Christian home, you can't help who your parents were. So you could have grown up with the same assumption that Jesus' initial hearers did. And that doesn't really take into consideration what Jesus is actually saying. What matters is not whether you occupy a seat on Sunday or not, although occupying a seat on Sunday matters. And we'll get to that in another seminar later when we talk about the church. But for the meantime, what matters is what Jesus says matters in the parable and in the explanation of the parable. That those that are represented as good soil receive the seed, the word, and live it out in perseverance. And so the other thing that we should be convicted by as modern people reading the story and understanding how it would have worked is to be slow to judge who is in and out of God's kingdom based on who is and who is not a church-going Christian. See, because remember, we said Jesus is doing multiple things with this parable. One of them is if you are an assumptive person and you think you're good, you probably also have a slew of people that you look at and say, but they're not. By what virtue? Because you have a special seat and they don't? You might want to be careful about that because that's not what your faulty judgment about where you're standing is also just as faulty when you apply it to somebody else. And so Jesus is doing that here. And so the core application is that the genuine members of God's kingdom understand the teachings of Jesus, follow them by applying them to their lives, and bear visible fruit when they apply Jesus' teachings. If we don't understand Jesus' teachings, we should have the humility and willingness to ask questions so that we can be fruit-bearing followers of him. And that's the beauty of us getting to see Jesus' most close followers, his original 12 and those around him, admit to him that they don't get it. It's good for us to admit that we don't get it and to be willing to give ourselves over to the work of God and the work in our lives to try to get it so that we can live and bear fruit, as Jesus says is most important. And so that is the parable of the sower as a case study of reading parables. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, we've got so many commentaries out there now that if you read something, like you say, you should ask.
Yeah.
If you don't ask, read the commentaries, then read your Bible, and read the commentary.
Yep. Yeah, so for those online, Point is using commentaries as a supplement to your Bible study can be helpful because it gives you an opportunity to read the context like the stuff we're talking about. And if you don't understand that, you can ask more questions and continue on in your study. And that is a good way of applying this idea of being humble and being willing to try to grow and understand. Thank you, Dee. I saw another hand raised. Yep.
This is something that's bothered me for some time.
All right.
In Matthew,
Yes.
I think it is 19.
Mm-hmm.
This people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they've closed their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
That refers back to Isaiah.
Yes, it does. Mm-hmm.
And I do have some friends that use this as a basis for predestination.
Oh, yes.
Idea. And I don't believe that's what Jesus had in mind.
No, again, for those online, I'll try to do this. So Jesus' quotation in Matthew and actually in the other Gospels is rooted in the book of Isaiah. And the question, or at least the comment that's kind of a question here, is that Jesus' explanation for why he preaches in parables and the bit about people hearing but not understanding, seeing but not perceiving. And then in the longer form in Matthew, the larger quote that's used, there's this line about the people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. So the question is, this gets argued to argue for predestination as a theological doctrine. And what I would say about this is let me think for the best way to say it. There's a difference in seeing something, an event, an action unfold, and pointing and saying, "Look at what's happening," and then saying, before the event is unfolded, this is going to happen and it can't be changed. Does that make sense? So what you have in Isaiah, and this is the case for all of the prophets of Israel, we today think about the word prophet and prophecy as a future fortune-telling sort of thing. Not fortune-telling, but I'm being somewhat facetious when I use it. But we think about it in terms of thinking about something that's going to come in the future. But the reality is that most of the time the prophets are looking back and they're looking at the circumstances around. A really good example of this is John the Baptist. People would have considered him prophetic. And what did John the Baptist do? Well, he came and told the people to repent and told everyone how nasty they are. In fact, he got beheaded for it because he ticked off the wrong guy. He started critiquing political power in the time and whatnot. So John wasn't saying anything that people couldn't have already viewed on their own, but he was boldly proclaiming God's word in the moment and telling it like it was. And the prophets in the Old Testament were doing the same thing. So when you read this, Isaiah's words are speaking about the reality of the people at the time. And so he's not saying that for all of time there are going to just be some people that won't, they're stuck on the outside, and that's, God made them to be destined for the bad place, and that's that. Also in saying that, it is also the case that I could confidently say there will be some people that get in heaven and some that won't. That is not a statement of predestination so much as it is just a statement of, if I sow seed in a field, some of it will grow and bear fruit and others won't.
I guess I was hoping you'd come up with a really wonderful thing that I can say to people, that this is not predestination.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I know I can get argumentative and/or I don't always shy away from debates on things, but in my heart of hearts, I would encourage you, and I know this is hard because you care about people or you get into these conversations and you always feel like I'm pretty sure you're not right, and I've got it on the tip of my tongue, but I can't quite get it out, and I wish I could tell you. I would encourage you to not necessarily worry so much about that, because the reality is, most people have a set of theological principles that are just within their, whatever their church tradition is, and they read the Bible through that lens. I will admit I'm not a systematic theology fan for that reason. That would be nice if there was just all these theological things and the Bible always was perfectly cozied up next to every. That's just not the way that it works. The Bible actually teaches things in tension sometimes. It teaches you things that seems to butt heads. In fact, this issue of predestination versus not predestination is kind of like that. Because, I always like to tell people like to argue similarly on the predestination, is there free will or not, Yes. I mean, this is the way I always look at it. Like, if I had a choice whether or not I was going to show up here today, I decided to come here and because I wanted to be with you all and teach. Huh? Well, yeah, you'll beat me up. See, I was threatened and coerced into being. Now, I wanted to be here, and I could have been doing something else, and you all could have been doing something else, and you chose to be here or whatever. But there's plenty in our life that we didn't have a choice. And I didn't get to choose my parents. I'm glad I have the ones I have, but I didn't get to choose them. I didn't get to choose my sibling. I didn't get to choose what town I grew up in because I was a kid, and I don't make those decisions. The adults did, which meant I didn't get to choose what school I went to, which means I didn't get to choose the peers around me that influenced me and that I influenced. Do you see where I'm going with this? Like, when we start thinking about it, like, I have free will insofar as I can make my own autonomous decisions in life, but I don't get to choose the sandbox in which I get to play around and make those decisions all the time. God gave me the set of people. Is that what you were looking for to say? Does that help? See, if I talk long enough, no, I'm just kidding. I come up, no, I'm just kidding. So that's what I would say. And the Bible really teaches both of those things. People have choice to obey God or not. They have choice to listen to God, to go to God for counsel and all that stuff. But just like you and me, they were born in a time and place they were and didn't get to choose all of those things. And in that regard, I guess they were fortunate, maybe not so fortunate in other cases. But so the Bible wrestles with the tension of those two seemingly competing ideas and instead says it's not an either or proposition, it's a both and. And so, and that's really what this parable does. It's not saying that you have no choice in the matter of whether or not you're going to be open to the word and be faithful to it. But it is also true that there will be people that are going to choose not to be those things, and there will be people that do choose to, and that's just a matter of fact. It's as simple as farming or anything else that you want to think about. So, you're welcome. Anybody else? Everyone knows it's game time, don't they? What? 2-minute warning. Yeah, I get you. I'll be turning the car radio on until I can get to the TV, but all right. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to pray, and then we will close up. And as always, if you have any other questions, you can ask me up front, or you can ask me later or whatever. David, we didn't get any questions online, did we? That you know of? No, we didn't get any. I didn't get any text from Aaron Adams, who was going to be my texter, which means there was no questions online. All right, let's pray. God, thank you for this time. Thank you for letting us study this parable of Jesus that on one hand is hard to stomach and on another hand is incredibly hopeful. I pray, God, that we will strive to be open to your word, to receiving it, to putting it to work in our lives, and to be persistent in doing so and to persevere in it. Help us to bear fruit and for the world around us to see that evidence so that they might know you through our witness. And we pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for watching online, those that have, or if you're not watching now, you might watch it later on demand. See you next time.